Now that we've gone out and sent our surveys out, so we've distributed the surveys, we're obviously going to have people start to take those surveys. And different responses are going to be coming back in based upon those options. And so now it really becomes a matter of what's available to us inside the application that's going to allow us to analyze how people are taking those surveys. Are they overall happy with what we're doing? Are they not happy? And that's really what we want to look at in this module. So we first and foremost want to look at the way responses are captured. So there's two ways that you can do it. There's responses and there's feedback. So we're going to look at kind of a comparison between the two because each one will be indicative of the type of survey that you're using. You're going to use responses more for kind of short-term surveys. You're going to use feedback generally for more long-term surveys like maybe the customer service survey that we've been working with. We're also going to look at how those responses are triggered. So as we mentioned, throughout the course, the surveys are actually hosted up in the cloud. They're not stored in Dynamics 365. So when it comes time to go out and actually get those responses and pull and trigger those responses in, they have to go out to the cloud and grab it. And every once in a while you'll run into situations where things just won't get triggered or maybe you won't get those responses coming back in. So we're going to look at how do you kind of refigure that or reconfigure that to re-trigger those automated responses to come in. We're also going to just give you an overview in regards to what some of the analytics and reporting options are that are available from a voice of the customer perspective. And then we'll talk more about working with responses and response outcomes and the overall information that's going to be available as part of the application. The way the application's configured, response retrieval is going to happen automatically. So whether you've decided to use feedback or whether you've decided to use survey responses, you will automatically have those responses be triggered on regular intervals. And those will be reported back into the application. And once those items have come in, you will then see those in the survey responses that you can work with. Now, the other thing that you'll see inside there is when we'll show you this inside the app as well, is when you go into the voice of the customer logs, it's going to show you the status of all the retrievals that have taken place, and it's going to show you how many responses that it pulled back. Now, every once in a while you run into situations where things may not be retrieving responses like you'd hoped. Maybe all of a sudden you just haven't gotten any responses back over the last hour or so, and you're not sure as to why. It happens. It doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while you run into scenarios. So one of the things that you can do is you can kind of manually reset that. And so then what happens is once you manually reset that, it'll then go out and re-pull for responses. And then typically, within about 15 minutes or so, you should be back onto the regularized schedule. But that's a good rule of thumb, is if you haven't seen something, within the last 15 or 20 minutes, something may have gotten stopped or paused, and you may just need to re-trigger that response processing, and then it'll pick things up and kind of work from there. So that's what I really want to show you here is just, let's look at what those responses look like as they're coming in, but then let's also go ahead and look at how you can trigger some of those individual items. As people are taking these surveys and working through things, you're going to start to get survey responses that will come back in. And this is where those would be typically coming into the application. Now at this point, we haven't necessarily had anybody take the survey yet, so we don't have a ton of different responses that are coming in, but this is where they would show. But let's use this as an opportunity to say, okay, well, what would happen if it had been processing for survey responses and for some reason I'm just not seeing anything in here? Well, that might mean that you need to re-trigger the processing. And that's done through the voice of the customer solution. So if I go into settings and I go into solutions, I'll see the voice of the customer solution. I can go ahead and open that up. And then remember when we first installed the application, we had a scenario where we had to opt in and say it was okay to use voice of the customer functionality. Now that we've enabled that functionality, this is where I can go in from this point forward and I can re-trigger those responses. So if for some reason something hasn't been processing, this is where I can come in and I can hit re-trigger. This will ask me if I want to go ahead and do that. It says that it's been triggered and that we just need to wait, up to 15 minutes or so to actually physically see those responses inside the application, which is fine. And again, it doesn't happen very often, but it's definitely something that does sometimes happen. If we're being very honest, I have noticed it more in, like trial environments and different things. If you're testing them from there more often than production environments. Production environments, it generally flows along pretty nicely, but this allows you to re-facilitate that and re-trigger that process in the app. As we talked about kind of at the top of the module, the survey responses are where you're going to see everything that's come in. And depending upon whether or not you've chosen to use feedback or whether you've chosen to use just standard survey responses, all of those survey responses will get communicated back into the application. So here is a good example of what you would see from an app standpoint in regards to what survey they took in regards to those responses. So I can see here from a customer service survey that I've had several different anonymous respondents that have taken this. I can see what time they took those individual surveys. And then I can also see that I had one called training survey and I had somebody take that. Each one of these options, I can then go in and I could open up and I could look at just some detailed analytics around those individual survey responses. Now, the other thing that's nice about this is I can filter this, or I could turn around and take it into Excel. And now from an Excel perspective, I could use pivot tables or all the different analytic pieces that run inside Excel to be able to really facilitate and work with this on a much larger scale. So this is that survey responses where they'll be coming in after people have taken them, and now you can start to use those to see scoring definitions, what people are working with. And then again, as these items come in, you could create workflows on these survey responses that say, if something happens in this type of response, if it's below this situation or this category or whatever the item is, this is where you could now customize the application to trigger specific functionality that you might want to do from an analytic perspective. Now, we talked a little bit about the reporting capabilities of the surveys themselves. One of the other things that's nice is each survey, when you go into the actual survey itself and you go into the dashboard, will have aggregated charts and survey information that you can look at based upon the invites and the responses that had come in. Now, what's nice about this is it typically just defaults to kind of a 4-tier dashboard, which is going to have 4 different chart options available. Each one of those chart options can be adjusted accordingly as you're working through. So I can see here that, I can look at responses by category, I can look at responses by facial expression, I can look at average net promoter score. These are all different options that I can sort out for each individual survey that I have taken. And this will be available for every survey once they've been published. Now, the other thing that's nice about this is is also available from a question standpoint as well. So when you go into each individual question, if you open up the details around those questions, you will see these same exact reporting options available from inside the question. So if you're looking to measure what's happening and look at some analytical information in regards to those specific surveys, this is what's going to give you that option to be able to do that. Now, the other option that you have is there are out-of-the-box reports. And so there's 3 baseline reports that ship as part of Voice of the Customer. There's the Net Promoter Score report, the survey export report, and then the survey summary report. So this would be an example of what a survey summary report would look like for like a customer service survey. So it looks at how, each individual question, it shows you how many people have taken those individual situations, and then what the average score was based upon what they've selected. And if there's multiple choice options available, it shows you each choice, and based upon the people who have taken that, you can see what the options are from there. So obviously, in this particular situation, we allowed half scores. So with this is using a scale of 1 to 5. So a 4.5 is about 90%. A 5 is going to be 100%. So this is what's going to show you based upon, how happy people are. These are showing you the specific analytics. So you can open up these reports for each individual survey that you have and then further examine the details around what's happening. So if I switch to the dashboard, this is where we'll see those analytics. So as the responses come in, this is where I can see all the individual options that have kind of come into here. So this I can start to see that we do have some responses and some items that have come in for this particular survey. So I can see how many survey invites have gone out. So I can see items that were sent by the survey. I can see average satisfaction rating based upon my scoring area that we've kind of defined for that option. And then each one of these options has different scenarios that I can filter in. And they're really just views that are being used to filter in these charts. So if you think about how you would create views in Dynamics 365, as a whole, it's that same tier process here. So you're just customizing views, and then these views are being presented in a web resource basically inside the charting option. So here's where I can look at all of the individual things that might be coming in there, and then I can define different chart options. So these are just different charts that I can see that are associated with individual items. So here's my total response count by day, so I can see exactly what's kind of come into there. So as this item matures, I can come into here and really drill into each one of these standardized items and define what's taking place within here. Now, the other option would be that reporting standpoint. So from a reporting perspective, if I come up into here, I can see that there's a run report option, and I have basically my 3 different reports. I have my Net Promoter Score report, I have my survey export, and then I also have my survey summary report. And when I open up my survey summary report, this is where now I could use basically my predefined reports to really drill in and see what's happening. I could modify filters on this, but I can look at each question that was laid out as part of this particular survey, and I can start to see how those answers have come into the application. So I can see how people were rating specific questions, and I have an overall detailed information in regards to all of these. I also could look at how we're looking at where things were invited. I could look at specific questions as a whole, but this gives me the ability to really start bringing the information down. So from an analytic perspective, there's a lot of options available. You just have to kind of find what's going to work best for you based upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Now, you also have this same type of situation from a question perspective. So for example, if I go back into my designer and I go into a page that has some specific questions defined, let's just go ahead and edit this question. And when I edit this question, there is a drop-down option here for charts. And now when I go into charts here, I can look at chart analytics specifically around this question. So, how many people answered those particular items? What were the options that they were working with? What are the question responses, the average question rating, answers that were selected? These are all just different options that I can look at to determine who took what particular options. Now, in this case, everybody happened to answer everything as very quick, but if they had answered it with different options, that would all be reflected in this pie chart. So there's a lot of different analytic capabilities available to you based upon what's happening and what's occurring in the application. If you remember when we were doing the response routing, we talked about how there was 2 different tiers of response routing. There was the client level that's really going to guide you through different areas of the survey itself, and then there's the server level, and that server level is going to create what are called response outcomes. So based upon how somebody answers a question, it's going to create a response outcome that might trigger feeding something into a queue or just assigning something to a queue within the application. So when you start to get these responses that come in, so when I go into Voice of the Customer and I look at, for example, survey responses, I can see here's the survey responses that have come in for each specific survey. But if I come in and choose response outcomes, here's where I can see those response outcomes that were triggered based upon how people worked with those response routing rules. So we had that one that we created that if somebody adjusted that score to happiness level of less than 5, that it was going to trigger a distress response outcome, which was ultimately going to assign this to a queue. This is where you have a complete list of all the different response outcomes that have happened. And so here I can see that I had an option take place. I can open it up. I can see what survey response option they were working with. I can see what the outcome type was. I can see what invitation it was associated with. And if this had been attached to a lead or an account, I would be able to see that within the application as well. And then I can also see what option caused this item to trigger within the application. And now from here, I could go into the queue and I would have somebody be able to see that within the queue. But this is where now you also have the capabilities to not only see how these items have been triggered, but you can actually see the detailed analytics around these as well. So from a solution perspective, there's just a lot of analytic options available to you when you start looking at how you want to address and work with these survey responses as they're coming in. As your respondents are taking your surveys, the analytical piece is critical, because that's ultimately what's going to determine how we act on those responses. If customers are happy and we want to continue the level of service that we're providing, we can see that directly in there and we can work with options from that standpoint. But if people are coming in and not necessarily happy with what we're doing, this is our opportunity to be able to act on that. So from an analytical standpoint, it's real critical to understand what those capabilities are. And as we saw in this last module, that from a voice of the customer perspective, there's several different methodologies that you can use. And so it's important to understand that as these respondents are taking your survey, you have to define, do you want to capture these as survey responses or do you want to capture these as feedback? Remember, survey responses are going to store all the responses for all of the surveys that you have published out into your instance in one table. And this really gives you the capabilities to now start to analyze multiple surveys over a period of time. You're typically going to use survey responses for probably 90% of the surveys that you're creating, because they're going to be more short shelf life type surveys where you're going to be able to go in and just do a marketing survey or something like that. When you start to need more long-term analytics and be able to customize things to really be able to look at those on a more detailed level, that's where feedback comes into play. And so feedback will create a custom entity inside your Dynamics 365 instance that you can then go out and use to really dive deeper into what people are saying. You have all of the same charting and reporting capabilities that you want to build into that feedback entity. Now, the big thing to remember with feedback is that has to be enabled per survey. So that is something that it does not happen by default. You have to define what specific surveys will meet the criteria to constitute using feedback, and then you can enable them for feedback from that standpoint. Make sure that you remember that you have a solution already created to store that new entity in, and then you can go in from there and customize that just like you would customize any other Dynamics 365 entity. If you elect to go more of just the response option, remember that the voice of the customer solution has a lot of different analytic and reporting options available. They have 3 out-of-the-box reports that you can run on any published survey that you have. They also have analytical or dashboard charts available at a survey level and at a question level. So if you're looking to see what specific responses people had to either individualized questions or as a survey as a whole, you could look at those options from there. And if you elected to use response routing, you will also see in there the response outcomes will show you exactly what took place if somebody answered a question in a way that would trigger one of your response routing rules to actually fire off a task or trigger off some type of response or survey outcome within the application. And then the final thing is, remember that if you haven't seen some of those responses within a specific period of time, you can always go back into the voice of the customer solution and trigger that processing, and in about 10 to 15 minutes you will start to see those responses coming back into the application, and then you can work with them from there. So as you can see throughout the life cycle of this course, the voice of the customer solution for Dynamics 365 is fabulous. There's a lot of capabilities and flexibilities out there to allow you to create very personalized and tailored surveys that you can use to reach out to your customers and start to engage them more in that entire process, whether it be marketing surveys to really go out there and see where we need to go from a company perspective from a directional standpoint, or whether it be to follow up with specific events that we've provided to our customers, or even try to go out from a customer service perspective and engage those customers after we've had some type of interaction with them to see what we've done well or what we could do better. And so over the course of this course, we looked at several different scenarios. The first thing that we did was really just provide an introduction and an overview to how the voice of the customer solution works. We've mainly focused on how does that get installed as a preferred solution, and once it's been installed into your environment, how do you opt into this application? Because remember, this is not something that from a survey perspective are going to be hosted traditionally inside your Dynamics 365 instance. The surveys are actually hosted out in the cloud, and then you actually have to go out, publish the surveys out to the cloud, and then trigger and pull in responses from there. So we looked at what that process looks like. We also talked a little bit about planning your survey and understanding, who your target audience is and what the use case is going to be around that survey. So as you're building these, you can build the most effective surveys for your audience. And we also looked at some of the introductory kind of personalization options around adding themes and working with images so you can present that survey in a way that's going to look best for your customers. We also talked about how to create and design your survey. We looked at how the designer window works, and we looked at how you can go in and add different pages to represent different screens that you want people to work through as part of that survey. We talked about how the different survey parts are plugged into those individual pages and how each one of those survey parts has personalization options that you can use to control things such as, how stars are presented on the application, to the actual labels associated with pick lists, to whether or not things are required or need responses or don't need responses as part of the application. We looked at how you can go in and set runtime functionality such as, links that are going to be displayed when people are working through the survey, setting up unsubscribe links, everything that you would want to know in regards to creating and getting those surveys ready to be distributed out to your individual customers. We also looked at more advanced type scenarios where you could do things like linking survey questions together from a reporting perspective, or using piped data inside your questions to provide a personalized experience to those who are actually taking the survey, and then how to work with response routing to be able to trigger different response outcomes in the application based upon how people have answered specific questions, or even to direct them to different areas based upon responses that they've given. We looked at how you publish that survey and the different options for distributing it. That can range from using an anonymous link to just pasting that into an email or into a web page somewhere, or creating a very personalized link that when somebody clicks on it can actually receive piped data from inside Dynamics 365 and populate that in a way that users can have a more tailored experience to who they are and be addressed by name and work with it in the context of why that survey was actually sent out to them. And then finally, we looked at responses, and we talked about the differences between using survey responses or having more of a dedicated feedback entity. And we looked at what scenarios you'd want to use one versus the other. We also examined some of the different reporting and analytic options. We looked at how you can go in and work with the survey outcomes that have come back based upon those response routing rules. But we also looked at the dashboards and the analytics that are available, not only from a survey perspective, but also from a question level, and give you a lot of different ideas around how all that information would work. So with that being said, I think you'll find that the Voice of the Customer solution is a wonderful addition to your environment. Just remember that, again, it's not out-of-the-box functionality. It's functionality that you do need to kind of bring in and add from there. But I hope you found this informative and informational. And again, my name has been Derek, and I want to say thank you very much for watching. Take care, and have a good one.